Welcome to the Stories in EDU podcast, the show where we talk with real educators and hear their powerful impact. Their stories will grab you, inspire you, and show you the reach of the work we do. And now, the Bretzman Group presents your hosts, Josh Gauthier and Mandy Taylor.
Welcome back to another episode of the Stories in EDU podcast, the podcast where we chat with great educators about stories that they have experienced throughout their time in teaching. As we adventure forward on this podcast, Mandy, what do you think is the biggest thing you've learned so far from our guests?
I think the biggest thing for me is just the idea of how we're all in the same boat, but in very different places. You know, that we've interviewed people from all different states. We've interviewed a couple of people that are out of the country now. But ultimately the stories are getting back to the same thing, you know, the empowering kids, having them, you know, helping them to find their voice and who they are. And it's just been really, really exciting for me to hear about the work that everybody's doing, how sometimes we feel so isolated, but we're really all kind of very much in the same boat.
I wonder if the better analogy would be that we're all in the same ocean in slightly different boats.
Yes, I like that.
And bringing another ship to shore with us tonight, and also a new state for us, we have Teresa Gross. Teresa, thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay, so I am Teresa Gross, and my background is in speech therapy and reading. So I have a love and a passion for books and language and reading and writing. So I am currently a middle school reading teacher outside of Rochester, New York. The majority of my day I teach intervention classes, and I do have one language and literature class that I loop with. So I start with them in 7th grade, and then I continue with them through 8th grade.
Tell me about looping. Like, what is it about? Did you choose that? Is that like something in your building that you do for a specific reason? I did a multi-age class for 3 years very early in my teaching career. And we had first and second graders in one room. And then when our second graders left, our first graders became our second graders. So we looped them and had that process for about 3 years. And I loved it and was fascinated with the whole process. So where does that come from?
So my principal actually did, I believe it was her thesis on looping. And so our 7th and 8th grade teachers loop with the students. So we have teams that the kids are assigned to, and they will have that same team of teachers for both 7th grade and 8th grade. I personally have had a great experience with it because even as a reading teacher, it almost is like looping with your kids because I might have the same kids from 6th to 8th grade in my reading intervention. But looping with the language and literature class, I really love it because I really get to know the kids. And I feel like when I head into that second year with them into 8th grade, I really have a great handle on where they are coming out of 7th grade, and I don't have to relearn all of that I might have to with a new group of students. Mm-hmm. But I think that the best part of it is now that they're nearing the end of the 8th grade loop is I have just seen so much growth in some of them from when they came to me in the beginning of 7th grade and now are going to be leaving me at the end of 8th grade, that I think if you didn't have them for those 2 years, some of them all of a sudden 8th grade it like clicks and you just kind of see everything coming together. So I really enjoy it. The challenge, of course, is if you have a challenging student, that for whatever reason, either they don't click with you or you don't click with them. But for the most part, I think that I've been really lucky and it's been a really good experience. I also think that I know what I taught them in 7th grade. So I know coming into 8th grade, like if there's things we need to review or there's gaps or, there's something in there. So I really enjoyed it. It's been a good experience.
Well, I always love when we have middle school teachers on the podcast just because I'm a middle school mom. And so, having my son in my school the whole time of, his whole elementary career. And then now he's about to finish 8th grade. So getting to experience the whole process. I said when we were doing our intros in the beginning, just that the middle school teachers, I just have the utmost respect for the job that you do. And with big classes often and big bodies and experiences and so much goes on in middle school with the, they're growing into who they are, and sometimes they're kids and sometimes they're adults, and they never know which, and I never know which as a parent I'm going to get that day. And I can only imagine that that's amplified when you have a group in such a small room, with that many kids and your content. So I just really value the work that you guys do with middle school kids. So,
oh, thank you.
So you mentioned you spend most of your time in an intervention type environment, working with students. At what point did you start doing that in your career? Were you in the classroom for several years first? You may have mentioned this, and then went into interventions, or did you kind of start there?
So I've kind of had an interesting job background. My first job was for a nonprofit organization. It was called United Cerebral Palsy. And I actually did preschool and home-based therapy. And then school had contracted out, so I worked in an elementary school. So I did that for a year. And then I moved into an elementary school as a speech therapist for 2 years. So that was my first 3 years. Then I went back to school and I got my master's in literacy. So then when I finished that, I actually was a speech therapist for my current district at the middle and high school level for 3 years. Then a reading position opened up, so I moved down to a K-5 building. Then we reorganized into a primary K-2 and an intermediate 3-5. So I went to the intermediate 3-5 for a few years, but now I came back to the middle school for the past 5 years. So
that is a journey right there.
I'm very flexible. I'm pretty easygoing.
Teresa, how do you feel like your speech background helps you in the work that you do as an interventionist?
Oh my gosh, I think it's invaluable. I think that my whole speech program as an undergrad, I spent 4 years learning about language development and oral language development and speaking and, just different kinds of speech and language difficulties that, students can have. So then when I went into my reading program, I already had all that background knowledge. And I find myself tapping into both. And especially when I worked with the younger kids as a reading teacher, I really used a lot of my speech background in combination with reading. But I think I'm so fortunate to have that combination. I think it's extremely helpful. It also, I think having the speech background, I tend to sometimes think more like a clinician. So I'm able to break things down, and it's kind of, okay, so a child is struggling in reading, but what are they struggling with? So, let's break that down. So I think sometimes I just have, because I didn't come out of a classroom, I have kind of a different perspective and viewpoint, on when we do have interventions and we do help the students, that you really have to know where they're struggling.
Well, and I think for teachers, that's one of the things that I've loved. I was in the classroom for 17 years and now am an instructional coach. But so my perspective has been, largely elementary. I've had my early childhood background. I did a K-1 split. I did 1-2, and then I went to third, and then I went back to first. But having those different perspectives really gives you a rounder view of some of the issues and how, I know that teaching third grade helped me when I went back to first, because I knew where they were headed, and I knew some of those things that I feel like helped me teach first grade better. But then when I taught third grade, having that first grade experience, like you said, I could really target a reading issue because I knew about phonemic awareness, and I knew about phonology, and I knew about things that I wouldn't just have known if I had started there. So I love the way that teachers are, because we have to be flexible. We never know. Like, maybe this campus will split next year. Maybe you will get moved to an entirely different grade level. Like, we have to just kind of roll with it all the time. And I think that it's interesting the way that you've taken those experiences, but how it's really helped you along that journey. I also office across the hall from our speech pathologist, and so I love listening to their work. It is fascinating what they do and how intentional they are, and the things, even walking down the hallway and the pointing things out, and they're talking about their way they hold their jaw, and they're always doing these. It's just fascinating how you said, like a clinician, it's so technical. You know, all of these stories right now about with teachers being on the forefront and how under-celebrated, underpaid, and it's been so interesting to me to read these stories about these teachers like, I have 2 master's degrees, I have this, I have this, I have this, and, you know, still fighting for that respect of a nation, I think. But it's just, I think that's fascinating.
Absolutely. You know, the world of speech pathology was unveiled a little bit to me last year. We had a student in our annual TEDx event who gave a talk about her journey through speech therapy and that she had gone throughout her entire schooling career, or most of it. And the most striking thing to me about it was, I think a lot of times I think in the normal population, we miss them, like, because we don't, like, they aren't necessarily, they don't have a learning disability, they don't have this or that. So when they come in speech pathology, you almost gloss it over because it doesn't strike you as severe. But as she gave her talk and talked about all of these things that she had to go through, and then how that affects her throughout her school day, like, it's a huge thing. And like, I have a renewed respect for our speech and language people, and a much deeper respect for the students that go through that on a daily basis, that are working through that therapy, and that there's a lot more that impacts than I think meets the eye. And that, just like all of our other kids, I mean, they have those things they're doing that we don't necessarily notice. So that was a recent thing for me.
That's wonderful. That's great.
So when you loop, and you're looping, you mentioned with the interventions and with the literacy class, or the literature class, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're IB, so we call it our language and literature, but it's essentially ELA.
Okay. So I want to double back to that, because I think that presents some interesting opportunities to build relationships with kids, and that, you know, my experience was a related arts, encore, whatever you want to call it, teacher. So at most I saw kids maybe 40 minutes a day for a quarter or maybe a semester, and then off they went. But because of my position, I did get to see them multiple years, and it was really fun to see them grow and be able to work with them and work on their skills over time, albeit for, you know, a more condensed period. So can you tell us a little bit about some relationships that you formed with kids, and where you've seen that go, and how that you've seen that affect them over the course of 2 years?
Yeah, so I think it's so different, because when they come into me in 7th grade, a lot of times I don't know a lot of them. So you're doing that more traditional building relationships and getting to know one another type of activities. You know, I talk to them a lot. I think that's one of the best ways to build relationships. And, you know, if it's possible, if they can, sometimes they come to my room during lunch. We talk about sports, and they can sign up on my calendar. If they put sports, you know, I'll go watch their sports. But I think the interesting thing coming into 8th grade is, even though you have the same students in front of you, they're not necessarily the same people that left you at the end of 7th grade. I think that middle school, they are going through a lot of changes. They're going through a lot of social changes, developmental changes, academic changes. They have a lot going on, and they're changing. Their personalities are changing, and they are starting to kind of figure out where they belong and where they fit. And so it's still almost getting to know them. It's just in a different way. So you have that established relationship with them, but you're kind of starting to get to know them as they're growing up as well. I think what I find in the 2nd year is they're a little more open with me because they have that trust down, so that they'll talk to me and have personal conversations or ask advice and things like that. There's definitely more of a comfort level that second year because they know me and they've had me for that year. I still, throughout the 2 years, I still kind of do the same types of things, just lots of talking with them, trying to tap into their interests and their passions. And, they do get really excited if I go watch them at a sporting event or do something like that with them. But yeah, it's definitely challenging. I think I've done a ton of reading about the middle school level, and what I see in front of me is what you would expect from middle schoolers. In some ways, I think that it has helped me become a much more patient teacher, even though that might sound odd, because they are who they are and they are where they are, and that's where they're supposed to be. So we just have to be patient with them, and, they can be very impulsive and they can make some poor decisions. But I think when you have those relationships with them and build those relationships, you can also have those really important conversations at both ways. They're pretty open with me, and I can be pretty open back with them.
Well, and that goes back to what I was saying before. As a middle school mom, I am always so thankful for teachers that know my kid, that it's hard. It's such a different ball game. Like from fifth grade, the amount of communication we get from the school, the amount of, this is your teacher's responsibility to communicate this, and then they go to middle school and it's like a noticeable change. And I don't know if that's just the way that it's designed but it's hard because for those of us, I never know, and sometimes if my kid's acting this way or this way, like I had one of my son's teachers the other day sent me an email and they were like, he just was not himself today. He's normally this and this, and he just was really, reserved and sullen. And it did a couple of things. The first thing is it helped me be more in tune to when he was home and was able to kind of open up some things. But the other thing is it made me intensely aware of the fact that she knows him and recognized something that ended up being kind of a big deal for our, and it just meant so much to me. And I know that, another teacher may have noticed it and not said anything, but the fact that she took the time to email me 3 sentences was amazing to me. And I bought her a book and a prize, and like it really does. Those relationships mean that he has more of a village of people supporting him and rooting him on. And that's so, it's just crucial from my perspective that I feel comfortable if he doesn't want to talk to me about something, or his dad, or, something like that, that he's got people that he potentially could open up to.
Yeah, I've had, sometimes even after they leave me and they go to high school, like I'll get, can I come down and have one of our talks? Like I really need to just talk about something. And I feel the same way. Like if the student feels off to me, I usually will go to the team and ask them what they're seeing. Like, is it just my class? Is everybody noticing something? I've contacted the counselors before and was just like, could you just like bring him or her down, just kind of have a little chat, and, just something doesn't seem right. But yeah, if you know the kids, then like when something just doesn't, like they're just off, like that's a good way to say it. But yeah, they sometimes will talk to us too about things that they wouldn't necessarily want to talk to their parents about. Like I've had a couple of kids who, just want to like discuss problems or talk things over and stuff like that. So those really, and I always tell them, it doesn't have to be me that is the person that you come to. I just want you to have somebody. Right. As long as you have somebody in the building that you feel comfortable with, that you can go to and you feel that you can talk to, that's what's important.
The more I think about some of this stuff, as I'm starting to get a few more years into teaching, I think this is year 7 right now, and I'm starting to see some students who I had in my previous district in middle school who are now graduating from high school, and I had them as sixth graders, and I saw them 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. I think more and more that one of the most important things we can do is almost what we're talking about here is like the shepherding role, in that, they're middle school kids. A lot of them are going to do really stupid stuff, and that it's so important that we provide this environment that we can call them on it, but we don't, like totally punish it out of them or do something so drastic that we impact their ability to make it through school for the next X amount of years. I just ran into a couple of kids almost quite literally the other day that I had in middle school I hadn't seen for 4 years, and it was amazing. They're both going to college, and they both seemed to be great, and they were happy to see me. And man, I remember they were really tough kids to have in class. They really were. But they've made it. And I think for most kids, obviously some will require a little more intervention than others, but for most kids, if we can just help them get through this process, this education like rite of passage, like I think they'll be okay. We just, like, we're there. I think our main role is that shepherding role is really helping keep them on the path somewhere. Like they might go this way and they might go this way, but as long as they're generally heading this direction, and the more we can do to guide them and make that as comfortable a process as possible, I think is huge.
Yeah, I think that's too where my principal said something like, middle schoolers act the way they're supposed to act, but then sometimes we seem surprised by that. So I think that knowing the students, but also knowing where they are developmentally is so important, because sometimes you have to choose your battles. You can't, and sometimes they're just being middle schoolers, and it's just, and sometimes too, the choices that they make, really, they just learn a tough lesson, and that's all they need. They don't really need a punishment per se, or they just know that what they did was bad choice, and and they've learned from it, and now so yeah, absolutely, definitely.
Well, you were talking about that just now, like sometimes they know, and the natural logical consequence is the only real lesson that they need, that they don't need the preaching that comes. I was in the Personalized PD podcast last night, and it was about feedback, and we were talking about feedback, and it made me think of how sometimes kids will, like when my son plays baseball, when my husband is working with him, he's always correcting everything that he does, if he's pitching or if he's batting or whatever. And I have to go inside sometimes. I can't handle it. And one day my son he said, I just need you to work with me like Coach Lawrence. And I was like, I was like, what do you mean? And my husband was like, what does he do? And he says, he lets me fix it myself unless I can't figure out why I'm doing it wrong. And I was like, I said, what do you mean? Tell me more. Because of course I'm always looking for the teaching metaphor, And he says, when I do something, when I pitch or when I bat, but I miss it or I know it, then he goes, do you know what you did? And he says, if I say yes, he goes, then fix it. And he doesn't coach me unless I tell him, I don't know why it's doing this. And I said, really, that is genius, because it empowers the kid. And Parker says, when I mess up, I know what I did. I just need to correct it. I need to, and I think that idea we can use that in so many ways, that a lot of times it's just kind of like, hey, that you don't have to be, like you said, you kind of have to pick your battles. Like, what's the most important thing about this? Or sometimes, I'll say, yeah, that was a really tough lesson that you learned, or what, and I think that's really I need to remember that parenting a middle schooler probably, I just kind of expect this, whatever. I have to keep thinking like, you're right. They're learning to be people, and good. This is good. I need this. Keep it coming.
I always feel like we can learn so much from coaches, like just watching coaches when they practice with the kids, like just thinking about practices versus games. And oh my gosh, I just feel like we can learn so much from them and the way that they talk to the kids, the feedback they give to the kids, the way they are with the kids.
Well, and his favorite, because of that relationship, he's like, especially in a game, if you're yelling at me in a game and I already know what I'm doing, then I'm just flustered, and I think how much more so in a classroom or in a setting where they're putting their own, themselves on the line in front of their peers and they're so outwardly focused. And so I just know my own, if anybody has listened to this podcast at all, they've heard me say that my son equates his love for the teacher with his love for the content, or opposite, that if he loves the teacher, he loves the subject. So right. 1 year I love science, 1 year I hate science, 1 year I love this, 1 year, and I'm like, it's not the whole content you've stopped liking in 1 year. It's that particular environment is not your favorite,
right,
and we've had to kind of navigate that. But if you have his trust and his attention and he knows that you're in his corner, then he will learn all about your plate tectonics, about your linear functions, about, the Civil War. I mean, it's just so important. Those relationships, so crucial.
Indeed. Well, Teresa, it has been awesome talking to you tonight. So we really do appreciate you taking a little bit of time to share with us some experience from your years and your obviously very varied adventures in education. But we have one more thing we do need to cover before we let you go, and that is our lightning round of the personalized PD game of stories by the Bretzman Group. So we have a card pulled here for us to all take a minute to tell a story about. Here it is. So the card we have pulled tonight says, use a Google tool. Tell a story about how you use Google Docs, Google Forms, or some other Google Suite tool to enhance or create a lesson. Was this the right tool? What are your next steps to go further? And did you know the name Google is derived from the mathematical term that is a 1 with 100 zeros after it?
I did not know that.
All right, Teresa, whenever you are ready.
Okay, so I would say that this year I had seen somebody use Google Sheets, and I had never thought to use that for reading and writing. And what they did was they put different story elements in categories across the top, and then they put the students' names down the side. So you share it as a shared document. So we had things like, I think it was, we were doing informational text at the time. So we had different categories for informational text, and then they all had to put their responses in. But it's hysterical to watch like 13, 14-year-olds go into a shared document like that and have never done that before. And they're all trying to type over each other. But the end result was then they get a very clear picture of if they're aligning with what the other people were saying and what, the majority of the class said. So I would totally use something like that again. I thought it was great. And, I learned how to do it in my class.
All right. Excellent. Google Sheets for the win. All right, Mandy.
I'm ready.
All right, go for it.
Okay. So one of the, I think, most under-celebrated Google tools from my perspective is Google Drawings. And I'm trying to use it more to, what I've been doing is I've been doing some presentations on kind of Writer's Workshop 2.0. So how to use Google tools for Writer's Workshop. So with the little ones, one of the things we do in Google Docs is go straight to insert drawing. So drawings opens up right there, and then they can brainstorm pictures and shapes and things like that before they start typing or dictating or any of that in the doc. And so then they're not having to open drawings and pull it in. You can just do it straight from docs. And so that tool has been really interesting. And then the other thing I like to do is put my Bitmoji into Google Drawings and then add the little logo on top of it. So like if I present at TCEA, I give myself a TCEA shirt or change out the logo on my clothes in drawings.
Nice.
You're welcome.
All right. I'm going to tell this story. So I often lament some of the things that Google lets go away. In fact, there was a big hubbub this week about another tool that decided to go paid. And that happens. But Google's problem is they just have too many things and they just axe things. So one of the things I actually liked that was way underutilized was the fact that you could use Google Drive for web hosting. So I taught a digital media tools class several years back now in which we got into some web design. So always whenever I start out with that, we do some like basic WordPad coding and then using HTML, and then they could put their files in this folder, and they had to do a couple things like make it public, but then like they could display their website, and it was an ugly link, but they could share it and they could actually test out what their website looks like online and have it online all hosted through Google Drive. And I really miss that, and I wish they'd bring that back. Also, side note, see, I go last, so I always get
No.
Side note about that was also a really good workaround for getting links to images in like actual images. So like a lot of websites that require an image link, they want that .jpg or .png on the end. So if you try and go from Drive, it doesn't work. It has to be hosted somewhere else. And so that was one thing you could use to get around that in Drive. But anyways, yeah. Well.
Sometimes Josh talks and I'm like, that's fun. Like, I don't know what he really means sometimes when he talks about stuff like that, hosting and HTML. I know what HTML is because I have a blog, but...
Give yourself more credit. Teresa, thank you so much for being on. Is there a place where people can go if they want to chat with you or learn a little bit more about the great work that you're doing?
Sure. They can find me on Twitter. My handle is at Teresa Gross 625. I also have a class account that is at Ms. Gross Literacy, and that's right in my profile on my normal, Twitter handle. I also do have a personal blog, and the link to that is posted right in my profile as well.
All right. Excellent. And I also want to mention, I think this episode will be out, before the end of April. So if you like hearing these stories, and I know you have stories of your own, I really strongly encourage you to check out the Stories in EDU book contest that's currently happening, at least through the month of April. And what that is an opportunity for you, if you've ever thought, I'd really like to share my stories or be a part of a book, but maybe haven't had an idea for a full book, this will give you an opportunity to submit a short snippet of a story, maybe 5,000 words, and have an opportunity for that to be included in a new book, which will be eventually coming out, called Stories in EDU. So you can find out more about that contest out at storiesinEDU.com. And feel free to reach out to either Mandy or myself if you have questions about that. But we've already had a lot of submissions rolling in, and we're looking forward to reading through those. And I think it's going to be an excellent book with all of these stories. And I know everybody who we've had on the podcast so far should totally write some of this stuff down and put it in there. Don't you think, Mandy?
Yes, it's so fascinating. Love it. I wish I had been recording, I wish the idea of blogging had spanned the years of, that I have been teaching, because so many times I've thought, I need to write that down. And I mean, those stories are lost until something like triggers, a song or a kid or something. And you're like, and then you remember these hysterical, sad or horrifying or, and precious things that have happened along the way.
Indeed. All right. Well, on behalf of Mandy and myself, we'd like to thank you for listening to Stories in EDU once again. We hope you've had a few laughs, been inspired, and maybe you want to come on and share your story too. We're always looking for new teachers who want to give this a shot. It's really not that bad. I think any one of us could handle it. It's just a fun little conversation. So until the next episode, thank you for listening, and we'll see you later.
Every educator has a story to tell. What story will you tell at storiesinEDU.com? Do you want your best story published? Well, here's an opportunity. The Stories in EDU book contest is looking for amazing people like you to write their true story for publication. Choose a category: overcoming obstacles, relationships, voice and choice, hooks, technology use, and that one kid. You don't want to miss this opportunity to tell your favorite story from inside your classroom or your building. More info at storiesanedu.com. Let's share your best story. Submit today at storiesanedu.com. We're waiting for your story.
Thank you for tuning in to the Stories in EDU podcast. Please be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Until next time, thanks again.